Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar titled Supporting a Supporter, Vicarious Trauma and Support Needs. And thank you very much to everyone for attending today. I hope it's a really interesting webinar for you and that you find the content really useful and beneficial. Just to introduce myself, my name's Jack Kushner and I'm Victim Support Events and Marketing Officer at Break the Road Safety Charity. And our main speaker today is Dr. Kieran Cohen. Kieran is Head of Therapies and Senior Lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London, and it's a real pleasure to have Kieran here today, and I think the presentation is going to be really interesting, and I think it's going to be something that's going to be really beneficial for all of us to hear. So just to begin the webinar, before I hand over to Kieran for her presentation, I'm just going to provide a very quick introduction about Break and sort of the charity and our background, and just some more information as well about our Southern project and initiative. So as Break as a charity, we've got two main aims, and they're to prevent road crashes and also to support the victims of road crashes. And our prevention work is a lot of that through our campaigning, through our communications team, and also through our community engagement work, which is going out into schools and providing resources for a sort of younger audience as well. And the support for victims of road crashes primarily is for our helpline, which is a free phone number that anyone who's been either bereaved or seriously injured for a road crash can call up for free of charge advice and guidance and advocacy. And just at the bottom of the screen is some information about some of the other projects that we run. There's Road Safety Week, which is coming up this year from the 20th to 26th of November. And there's our Fleet Safety Awards, which is celebrating best practice within the industry. And there's also the Sun Initiative, which I'll talk a little further about now. So Sun's a project that was set up through Break, sort of recognising the experience that we've got through our helpline of supporting victims of road crashes. And through Sun, we try to provide best practice and research sort of resources and events as well for professionals who are supporting people who've been suddenly bereaved. We've got a number of events that we've got planned, and for the remainder of the year, we've got a few events that we're just working on the dates for, but we have our annual Police Family Liaison following Road Death and Serious Injury Conference, which is going to be in Birmingham in October. And we're just about to begin our planning process for our 2018 schedule of events. And as soon as those events have all been scheduled and announced, they'll all be up on our websites, and the link is sundef.org/events. And through Sun as well, we also produce a number of resources that are available free of charge for professionals. And some of the topics that these include are guidance papers on things such as support for bereaved children and young people, and looking at issues such as PTSD and traumatic bereavement. And they're all available on our website. The link is at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be sending out this presentation following the webinar if anyone would like to click on the link and just download some free of charge copies of these. We also have a number of resources up on our website which are available for carers, and these are all also free of charge to be accessed, and they cover things such as looking at the sort of timeline of support for someone who has been suddenly bereaved, and sort of issues such as viewing a body potentially following a bereavement and providing advice to that bereaved person. Some of the other resources that we're able to produce and provide free of charge include our Coping with Grief When Someone You Love Dies Suddenly book, which is available free of charge to download from our website as a PDF, and it's also available to download free of charge from our online shop. And we also produce a book called Someone Has Died Suddenly. It's a children's book that follows two characters called Amy and Tom, who've been suddenly bereaved, and it's a really nice sort of colourful introduction for any child who might be going through that sort of terrible grief and shock themselves, just to be able to relate to almost to two sort of characters going through perhaps a similar experience to them. And it also it's accompanied by a guide for adult carers, just to provide some sort of advice on how best to use the book, but also some really good sort of resources and other organisations who are able to offer support as well. And if you'd be interested in sort of finding out a bit more about Sun and keeping up to date with us, we've got a number of sort of different communications channels. We've got a blog which is up on our website, and we also have a fortnightly bulletin which is available to sign up for free of charge, which includes things such as details on all of the events that we've got coming up, any resources that we produce, and also sort of research and best practice initiatives that we've become aware of. And we also provide information about these through our Sun account on Twitter, which is available at @sun_break. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, we're always really happy to hear from any professionals. So if there's anything you'd like to find out more about or to just ask us, please feel free just to either give us a call or drop me an email. My details will be in this presentation, which I distribute, and they're also available from the Sun website if you'd like to find out a bit more through that. I'm now going to hand over to Kieran for her presentation. Hi, Kieran.
Hi, Jack. How are you?
Oh, yeah. I'm great, thanks. I'm just going to hand over the screen to you now so that you're able to show your presentation.
Okay, fantastic, thank you.
If I can just find the right button to click.
Oh, great, I think I got it.
I think that should have now handed over to your screen. That's perfect, I can see your slides now.
Fantastic, all right, thanks, Jack. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Karen, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about vicarious trauma, as said in the title. So we are going to start off by looking at what is and what isn't vicarious trauma, and then a little bit about how it occurs and how it develops, and what are the things which make us more or less susceptible of experiencing vicarious trauma. And that, I think, will take us probably about halfway, maybe a little bit more. And then we're going to move on to discuss the other end of the impact of working with people who've experienced trauma. And that's about vicarious post-traumatic growth. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that and what it means. And then at the end, we're going to wrap it all and talk a little bit about implications and maybe some of the stuff that you can apply to your own work, or at least reflect on your own work. And I'm really hoping that you will find this interesting and useful. So we're going to start our journey by looking at trauma. And I have used here the definition of the DSM-4, which is a definition that looks at a traumatic event as an actual or threatened death or serious injury to a person. But it also includes witnessing a traumatic event and also learning about a sudden and violent, unexpected death of somebody that you love. So it's a very broad and wide definition. I know that it has changed a little bit in the new DSM, and people sometimes use even broader definition than that to include all kinds of interpersonal experiences like divorce, and some people use a much narrower definition of trauma. But generally, this is an event which is outside of our normal experiences, or outside of what we would normally expect to be experiencing in life. The impact of trauma can be considerable and quite significant to a person. So at the really end of the spectrum, you can find PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, which some of you may be very well familiar with that, which includes symptoms like arousal, so nightmares and thoughts, intrusion like nightmares and thoughts, and hyperarousal and hypervigilance, issues of avoiding all kinds of aspects related to the trauma, emotionally or physically, and also significant changes to cognition and emotions. So while that's at the edge of the spectrum, obviously there are other potential psychological impacts. And we can find all kinds of things that people would experience, including depression, impact on self-esteem, feeling guilty, feeling ashamed, being confused about who you are before the trauma and after the trauma, increase in aggression and aggressive behavior, and some difficulties in creating intimacy or maintaining intimacy in personal relationship. The issue with trauma is not that it extends beyond the individual. So the impact of trauma also affects the people around the person who've experienced the trauma. And that means that be their family, spouses, children, or even people who work with them. And I think this is what we are discussing today. Today we're discussing the impact that trauma has, or trauma work has, for the people who carry out that work. So when we look at trauma work, when working with people who have experienced trauma, there can be all kinds of different things that we can experience. And a lot of the time when you look at the literature, these things are not really differentiated, but I thought it'd be really important to try and see what each of them means and how they're different from each other. So I'm going to start off by talking about burnout. And burnout is a motivational syndrome. So it is about emotional exhaustion. Oh, sorry, I just realized that you might be seeing that as well. About emotional exhaustion and cynicism that occur in individuals. Now, when Maslow discussed this in the 80s, they said it's about people who do people work, But I and others think that actually that might not be quite the case, as this can affect everybody in almost any work. And burnout has three major aspects. One of them is emotional exhaustion, so really feeling that you're really tired, you can't be bothered to do anything, you feel empty and emotionally unavailable. The other aspect is feeling of lack of personal accomplishment, so you feel that you're not really doing your work very well, you're not happy in the way that you're doing your work. And the third aspect is an aspect of depersonalization, so feeling almost dehumanizing the people that you work with, your clients, having a very cynical and negative attitude towards them, and feeling really that they're not really worth the effort. Burnout occurs normally after you have been exposed to prolonged exposure to ongoing work stress, and it's a really hard condition. So by the time you're burnt out, it's really hard to claw your way back to not being burnt out. And in that aspect, it's really important for us as professionals to be mindful of burnout and kind of monitor where we are, because the best way about burnout is actually not to experience it. In my presentation, I put those bits are examples of items in Maslach questionnaire for burnout. If anybody is interested, just out of curiosity, to check how you're doing, you can obviously access that questionnaire online and see where you're at in terms of burnout levels. But as I said, burnout is by no way specific to the work that we do with traumatized clients, and it's actually not even specific to helping professions. Unlike burnout, compassion fatigue is actually specific for those in helping professions, because it reflects or relates to a situation where people who normally use empathy as part of their work are no longer able to use empathy because they are no longer able to access that aspect of emotion. They feel emotionally exhausted, and there's the numbness, there's an emotional numbness around it, and they can't feel empathy anymore for their client or compassion for others. So normally when we get compassion fatigue, we will feel that we don't longer feel anything when we hear the client's story. So even though we can hear some horrible things that our clients are telling us, we are not emotionally engaged in it. They are increased in clinical errors. So if you are a therapist, you would make interpretations you wouldn't normally make. If you some kind of you do other intervention, if you're another type of helper in the helping profession, you would say something that you wouldn't normally say, and sometimes it means that we're saying things which are insensitive and can be perceived badly. It will also link to anxiety and depression, and one of the indicators is that we see people taking more and more stress-related leaves. Like burnout, this is a quite difficult condition to experience as a work, especially in the health and the helping professions. And later on we can discuss maybe a little bit how we can avoid those. So burnout and compassion fatigue, two conditions that we can experience when doing trauma work, but they're not inherently linked to trauma. The other two aspects that I'm going to talk about, secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, are obviously very much related to the trauma and the traumatic experience. So starting off with secondary traumatic stress. So that secondary traumatic stress refers to a condition where the person helping the person who've experienced trauma is experiencing PTSD-like symptoms. Although we have not experienced the trauma itself, just by working with somebody who's experienced the trauma, we are developing symptoms similar to PTSD. So that would include symptoms of arousal, intrusiveness, avoidance, and also compassion fatigue, which is linked to negative alterations to emotions and cognitions. So secondary traumatic stress is very much linked and seen within the context of symptoms, of psychiatric symptoms. And in effect, it was used a lot before the DSM-5, and now the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual that most health professionals used for diagnosing psychiatric and mental health conditions. So in DSM-5, they've included secondary traumatic stress as part of the definition of PTSD. So today, you can actually be diagnosed with PTSD even if you have not experienced a traumatic event, but rather worked with people who have experienced a traumatic event. And this has really quite a lot of implications. One of the good implications that it has is that people who work with people who've been experiencing trauma may now get some better access to support in terms of health professionals. And I think for the UK it may be less important, but in areas where there's a private insurance involved and you need a diagnosis in order to get finances to get some support, having a diagnosis, a recognized psychiatric diagnosis, actually helps in those situations. The other aspects of it is that it has implications to the organizations, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but in 2016, so last year, there has been a lawsuit against Microsoft. So 2 of their employees who were doing content development, so they were basically screening the internet in order to exclude all kinds of inappropriate material. So they have sued Microsoft for PTSD, saying that they have developed PTSD. And in that aspect, that means that organizations are now becoming increasingly more aware of the potential of their employees to develop secondary traumatic stress or PTSD because of their work, and they are getting a little bit more mindful about the need to support and make sure that it doesn't happen to the people who work with this company. Generally, secondary traumatic stress, unlike burnout, that takes a while to develop, and also vicarious trauma, as we will see, that can take a while to develop. Secondary traumatic stress can develop suddenly, so even when you're not expecting it, it can just occur, just like a reaction to a traumatic event. So unlike secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma does not necessarily include psychiatric symptom, and people who experience vicarious trauma may not experience as severe symptoms as people who experience secondary traumatic stress. But vicarious trauma does include a very significant change in the way that we perceive the world, and the way that we perceive ourselves, and the way that we engage with life as a result of our trauma work. So as a result of having an empathic connection with somebody who've experienced trauma and being exposed to their traumatic narrative. Now I'm going to break it down a little bit because this is a very broad definition. And in order to do that, I want to visit one of the theories which links to what happens to us when we experience trauma, and then I'm going to apply it to explain vicarious trauma. So for those of you who are familiar with the theory, I'm going to talk about the assumptive world and the basic assumptions theory. Ronnie Jennifer Bollman, who's a psychologist, so she basically summarized the theory, or created a theory, which says that all of us have very basic assumptions about the world, about ourselves, about others. And these are the basic building blocks of cognition. So they're not even thoughts yet. These are just approaches to life, general approach that we have to life, general approach that we have to ourselves, and general approach that we have to others. And generally speaking, while all of us know that there's some horrible stuff going on in the world all of the time, there's genocide, there are earthquakes, there, lots of really negative things that happen in the world. Most of us in our really localized world would think that the world is okay. And most of us will think that overall we have some sort of control over our lives. A little bit, not all of it. But, if we eat healthily, if we exercise, we are less likely to have a heart attack. There's a feeling that there's some sort of meaning to it, a cause and effect of sorts. And also, although, yeah, we're not perfect, most of us really like ourselves. We're okay. So most of us will have an assumptive world which says that the world is benevolent and there's meaning in our lives in the world, and that, yeah, we are worthy, we are worthy human beings. It's true that not all of us, some of us might not have these fairly positive basic assumptions. So some of us might actually think that the world is awful, we have no control over it, bad things happen all the time, and we are not really worthy of anything. But this is more linked to conditions like depressions and anxieties. And most people that we meet will actually, at the basic level of their approach, will have more positive basic assumptions. So our assumptive world, our basic assumptions, our basic cognitions that we have, they tend to be stable across life. And the reason is that our cognitive system in generally doesn't like to change. Generally, as people, we don't like to change. Unless we really have to, most of us would rather stay the same because it takes a lot of effort to change. And the cognitive system is a very efficient system in terms of energy. So as much as possible, it will try to maintain stability, and it will also try to maintain coherence. So all of our assumptions will more or less work with each other into a coherent worldview about the world and ourselves and others. That means that when bad things happen to us, like failing a test or breakup or all kinds of other stuff, we will alter the truth a little bit in order to adjust it to the way that we feel, so we wouldn't really have to change our basic beliefs. And you can see that if you can think about somebody who has very different political views than what you have. And when you have a little argument, you can both look at the same thing but reach very, very different conclusions. And those conclusions would normally confirm what it is that you believed it anyway to begin with. So why am I telling you all of that? Well, because what happens is that when you experience trauma, this little alteration of truth cannot happen anymore. The traumatic event is so beyond what we're used to, is so beyond what we thought would happen, that we cannot really keep our assumptive world as it is without questioning it. And when a trauma happens, there's a cognitive process, a cognitive activity that starts to occur, which basically tries to look at the shattered assumptions and try to rebuild the assumptive world again. And while that is going on, we will experience all kinds of rumination, intrusive memories, flashbacks, and all kinds of symptoms that we see in quite a lot of clients. As a result of that activity, we will either assimilate or accommodate this traumatic event into our system. So either we have a system which, for some reason, actually can incorporate a traumatic event, a horrible thing that happened to us, without having to change it. That's an assimilation. But in most cases, we will have to accommodate, we will have to change our basic beliefs in order to incorporate or incorporate the traumatic event into our cognitive system. Some of us might not reach neither accommodation nor assimilation, and then we will be stuck in an incomplete processing cycle. And when that happens, that normally refers to PTSD, where all these symptoms about rumination, intrusive memories, in fact, they keep on occurring and occurring and occurring because the system has not yet reached that level where there's an integration of the traumatic event into the system. Avoidance in those situations does not help. I mean, obviously avoidance is understandable because this cognitive processing stage is really unpleasant, where everything loses meaning. Everything that you ever thought you knew actually loses all meaning and logic. So it's not a very pleasant place to be in. But if you're not in that place, then you're kind of stuck in that place for longer. It's a little bit of a paradox. And once the person who has experienced trauma managed to create a new assumptive world through accommodation or assimilation, this world can either be more adaptive or adaptive, and therefore the person is able to open up and re-engage with life and the world, or it can actually be non-adaptive, and in that sense that person is less open to the world and more closed to new experiences. When talking of vicarious trauma, we are actually looking at a very similar process that happens. But it happens to us as people in the helping professions without experiencing the trauma or their trauma. It happens to us because we are empathically engaged with somebody who has experienced trauma. So this is about when we're working with people who have been through a traumatic event, and we listen to their stories, or we empathically listen to their stories, and therefore we are opening ourselves up to a risk of an impact that those stories might have. And if we listen to the stories or engage with this story for a long time, then it might impact the way that we view the world. It might impact the way or change our cognitive schema. And these are not necessarily specific thoughts, but really general approaches to life and others in the world. And a lot of the time, when you look at therapists who do that kind of a trauma work, you would find that some of them feel that it impacted the way that they feel less safe. They don't trust people as much. There might be an impact on their self-esteem, on their ability to create intimacy, and they lose some sort of a sense of control over their life and what happens to them. And in order for it to be a vicarious trauma, this change to cognition has to be pervasive, cumulative, and permanent. So we are again talking about a change to who you are in a very fundamental way, and in a way that it's negative, and it's negative because it closes you off from life. So it kind of like causes you to withdraw and be less engaged with possibilities and things that happen with life, and therefore that's why we think is a less adaptive reaction. People who experience that type of change might be, most of the time, it will also be linked to some sort of distress. And once you have created a new, less adaptive, assumptive world because of the vicarious trauma, then everything else that you would see from now on will then obviously be interpreted within that framework. And because of our cognitive system, we will almost actively look for things to corroborate that, yeah, that you can't trust anybody, that the world is not safe, horrible things can happen at any time, and that you really should look after yourself because nobody else will do that. Now, taking a little break from vicarious trauma before I go on to discuss a bit further about risk factors and how we can prevent vicarious trauma, or at least reduce the risk of developing vicarious trauma, because as you probably imagine, it's not a great place to be in. I'm going to talk a little bit about road accidents. So vicarious trauma in general, it's not trauma specific, but when I talk about vicarious trauma with different people, I really try and see if there's any research about the particular trauma that they've been working on. So I've been searching for research about people who work with survivors of road accidents, and the reality is that I really couldn't find anything on vicarious trauma. So it might mean that there's nothing there, or it might mean that my search skills might need some improving. But either way, I mean, there's very little research on this particular trauma. Most of the research that I could find was actually about the survivors of the trauma, which was also interesting, because what it showed is that relative to other trauma, people who survived road accidents have or experience relatively moderate levels of psychological symptoms. And also the research showed very different rates of severe psychological impact, like PTSD. It starts off from about less than 2%, which is fairly low relative to other traumas, to 16%, which is moderate to high relative to other trauma. And what is most important, I think, is that the psychological impact was moderated by all kinds of various aspects. So it's really important to know whether there was an injury in the accident, was a pre-trauma depression, how people experienced the accident itself, whether there was a fear of dying, or whether they really were very, very distressed, or the perceived level of threat. and whether or not they were the driver or the passenger. So all those factors will really impact on the way that the person is going to react psychologically. Now, the way that the person is going to react psychologically will obviously have an effect on the person working with that person. And therefore, when looking at vicarious trauma in relation to this very particular type of trauma, I couldn't find any research on it, but I did have some thoughts about it, and I'm sure you might have some more. So what I was thinking was particular about this trauma is, first of all, how driving is such an activity that all of us do almost every day. So we either drive as passengers or drivers. But I think more importantly, the people we love drive. So it might be our parents, our spouses, our friends, our children drive, which means that this event is very close to all of us. And in terms of vicarious trauma, it must have an impact on either the content of how our cognition around this area, or maybe even the likelihood of developing or not developing vicarious trauma. But these are just initial thoughts, obviously, because there's no research on that. And I will visit this idea a little bit later on. And just another thing that might also be linked about the empathic connection that you might have with our client is the fact that maybe some of the people who are also victims of road accidents may also be the ones who actually caused the accident, and that's a very complex thing to work through as obviously as a client, but also as a person who working with those people. As I said, I'm going to revisit the potential importance of the type of trauma a bit later on in the presentation. But for now, I want to discuss a little bit about how can we prevent vicarious trauma. What are the things that we can do maybe to reduce the risk of developing vicarious trauma? So let's look at risk factors to begin with, and there are a few. One major risk factor is our coping strategies and negative coping strategies. So obviously we are all going to be impacted by the narratives or the traumatic narrative experiences of the people we work with. And the way that we cope with that will have an impact of whether reducing or increasing our risk to developing vicarious trauma. So if we are self-medicating, but any type of medication, whether it's over drinking, smoking, or other types of medications, or withdrawing ourselves from other people and experiences, then we are opening ourselves up and increasing our risk to developing vicarious trauma. Personal stress is also one of those factors that has been found in studies to increase the risk of developing vicarious trauma, and it makes sense because if we're going through divorce or separation, if we are under stress in our personal life or going through a personal bereavement, it is obvious that an additional stress would open us up or make us more susceptible of developing some sort of a maybe less adaptive reaction to that. I'm going to approach gender very carefully. So women tend to report higher level of vicarious trauma, but for obvious reasons I'm very careful about that. I'm not quite sure that women are more susceptible. It is a finding that was found in various studies, but I think it probably might be linked more to the reporting of vicarious trauma rather than the experiencing of vicarious trauma. But I might, you know, somebody might prove me wrong. But this is how I choose to interpret the finding. The percentage of trauma work, so the higher your caseload in terms of trauma work, the higher is the risk. But the interesting thing is it's not just general workload which is important, it's the type of work that you do. So while most of us cannot really reduce our workload for various reasons, there might be ways that we can do, ways in which we can diversify the type of work that we do, either with slightly different clients or maybe some administrative work and other type of work and all kinds of those aspects. When this is possible, it kind of helps reduce the risk for vicarious trauma. Personal trauma history is again one of those things that was positively correlated with vicarious trauma, so it might be a risk factor. However, obviously it's not the fact that you had a trauma itself, it's the way that the trauma was processed. So if you have been through a traumatic experience yourself. It does not mean that you are necessarily going to develop vicarious trauma. It all depends on how well you have processed your own personal trauma, and obviously how aware you are of it and how much support you get for it. And finally, an overall exposure. So the more we work with trauma and people who've experienced trauma, the more we are susceptible to experience a prolonged or permanent negative change to our approach or cognitive schemas, and that makes sense because we are more and more exposed to a narrative in an empathic way, and that will have an impact on the way that we see the world and ourselves and others. So what can we do when on an organizational level in order to help people avoid developing vicarious trauma? So in terms of organizational support is one of those things, and organizational support is important for vicarious trauma and all the other negative impacts that I've mentioned before, so burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress. A lot of the times you will find supervision at the top of the things that organization can do, and that's true, but there are other things which are not as highlighted as highly, and these are related to an atmosphere, a culture of work, and it comes up again and again. So work environment which are tolerant, open and accepting, and when there's a good communication between people who work there, would decrease the chances of people developing vicarious trauma, probably because people are, for various reasons that I'm talking about in a minute, but also because people are feeling that they can actually open up to other people and get more support in that sense. In terms of our own responsibility, so self-care is one of those things that come up again and again, and it is about making sure that we have a life outside of work, so making sure that we are able to separate as much as we can our work life and be engaged with life and activities outside of work, and having enough social support, enough friends, people who are close to us, we can actually go and talk to them and feel loved and supported. And that again links back to the atmosphere, work atmosphere, which I think is one of those, it potentially can be one of those areas where we can get more social support. The last three things I'm going to talk about are actually resources, so things that we have that we can use. Those of us who are spiritual, then we are very lucky because spirituality has been found over and over again in all research related to happiness and resilience as a very good resilient factor that you can draw on when you experience stress and other negative things. So spirituality is a very good personal resource to have. However, not all of us have spiritual or have spirituality as a personal resource, and those of us who do not have that, we're still fine. There are other things that we can use, and two of those are optimism and humor. A lot of us see optimism as a result of something, but it's actually it's a trait, and if you are an optimistic person, then you can draw on that in order to cope with life and also with stress, and it's been found to help reduce risk of vicarious trauma. And lastly, humor, which is a very important human resource and links back to the work atmosphere. If there's a little bit of humor within the work environment, it can be a huge relief. And I'm not talking about cynical, dark humor, although that might help sometimes, but this is about more kind of stress relief humor that connects people and links people together. So that might be a very important resource that we can draw on. And with a direct continuation of that kind of positivism and optimism and humor, I'm moving on to discuss something which is a lot of the time a little bit neglected by everybody, and that's that the impact of trauma work can be very much negative, as we just discussed. So it's really hard work. Working with people who've experienced trauma is hard work, and if we don't experience any sorts of negative emotions, or any sort of negative thoughts or impact, then we're not really doing our job. So obviously we are all going to feel really hard and difficult feelings at times, but we can also experience a different type of experience. And when we talk, and maybe some of you as well, talk about people who've been doing trauma work for a long time, you hear all kinds of things that people are saying which are not necessarily negative. So the impact of the work sometimes has a very positive impact. People feel that they grew, they became better people because of the trauma work, because of the work that they've done with people who've experienced trauma. And this is what I refer to when I'm talking about post-traumatic growth and vicarious post-traumatic growth. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I'm going to start with what growth is not. So when I say about people who have experienced growth, I don't mean that they coped well with the stresses of their work. I also don't mean that they were strong enough so to withstand the stresses of the work, so not to develop vicarious trauma or any of the other negative impact. I'm also not talking about purposefully looking for a positive aspect of that work, and nor am I talking about positive feelings, so feeling happy and joyful around this. And why am I concentrating on what it's not? Because in the literature, if any of you is interested in reading about it, all of these things are kind of being incorporated together. But when I talk about vicarious traumatic growth or any type of post-traumatic growth, it is very much similar to what we were talking about in vicarious trauma. It's a change in approaches to life. It's a change in the cognitive schemas. And post-traumatic growth and vicarious post-traumatic growth, they are naturally occurring. So post-traumatic growth will naturally happen, might happen, not everybody experiences it, but those who experience it will experience it. And it will change the schema, the cognitive schema, in a way which is positive or perceived as positive by them. So when looking at vicarious post-traumatic growth, we are actually talking about changes that we might see or notice in who we are, and we can see those changes in a positive way. On the face of it, I'm sure it sounds very straightforward. Of course we would, why wouldn't we? But when we look at the details a little bit, we will see that there's some things which are not very clear about. So how does that happen exactly? How does trauma work can lead to us feeling better about ourselves? And I'm going to look at it for a little bit. So when we look at vicarious trauma as before, things are fairly clear. There's an exposure to a traumatic narrative. We are empathically engaged with a person who has experienced the trauma, and therefore the assumptions that we always held about the world and ourselves and everything else is shattered and challenged in the way that we need to change it. And when we do change it, and that change might be negative change, which closes us to the world and our experiences, then that would be vicarious trauma. Now, on the other hand, we know that sometimes some of us might have changed in a way which is positive because of our trauma work. We know that we've become wiser, we're more empathic, or we're more connected to people, or we reevaluated what's important to us and realized that family is more important than anything else, or anything. So we can recognize that positive changes have occurred because of the trauma work, but we're not quite sure how that happened, and whether that change is a change of our basic approach to life, or is it maybe a more local change. And what is it that we were exposed to? Because it's unlikely that being exposed to a traumatic event would cause a positive change in schema. Nor is it clear whether or not we have to be empathically engaged with somebody in order to experience growth. So there was quite a lot of questions about vicarious traumatic growth, and I'm going to present 3 different studies that I've been involved with that try to address some of these questions and see whether we can clear up some of this and understand a little bit about that particular impact that we can all experience as part of our work. So the first study that I'm going to discuss very briefly, it was a quantitative study, and we administered questionnaires, quite a lot of them, to counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK. There were questionnaires about sense of coherence and sense of control, organizational support and personal support, and all kinds of stuff that links to vicarious trauma. And we wanted to see whether they impact the potential to grow from the trauma work. And really, we were looking at empathy. And what we found, well, it was slightly inconclusive. So we did find a positive correlation between empathy and growth, but only in one aspect of growth. So people who were more empathic or more empathically engaged felt that they developed better in life because of their work, because of their trauma work. They can relate to people better. And for us, it wasn't. I think it's not a very convincing finding. And it really highlighted the fact that we really don't know a lot about the process of how can people positively change as a direct result of their trauma work. So another study, I think, highlights this or provides a slightly better answer, and this was a qualitative studies done with interpreters who work with refugees and asylum seekers. And because it was a qualitative study, it was more exploratory, and in that sense, I think, provided us with slightly better answers. And what we found after interviewing the interpreters about their experiences of working with refugees and asylum seekers are a few things. The first thing that we were looking at is whether or not the empathic connection has to be there in order for you to feel growth. And we find that there was an element of empathy in what the interpreters said. So basically they felt that they were psychologically closer to the clients. Now, some of it had to do with the shared culture and shared history, because some of the interpreters were also refugees, but some of it also linked to the technique of being an interpreter. So when you're an interpreter, you speak in the first person. If the client is saying, oh, and then they took me to this dark room, you will be saying exactly the same sentence. So they took me into the dark room, rather than saying they took him. So these aspects together meant that the person felt that they're identifying with the client, they feel very close to them. And that had two basically emotional impact. One was they felt much more distressed and had very strong negative reaction. They felt really sad, and they felt that they kept on thinking about it when they went home. But then there was another aspect of this closeness, and that aspect happened when they met the person after a few months. So they met the person when they just went into therapy, and then they saw them again after a few months, and they saw the recovery, and they were amazed, and they were absolutely shocked. And that shock was very similar to the shock that they felt when they heard about the trauma. So when they heard the traumatic event, they felt almost disbelief about how can human being create so much suffering to other human being. And there was one type of shock and disbelief which caused them to maybe question some of their assumptions about life in general. But then there was another shock a few months after, when they saw how well a person became and how resilient they were. And that was a very different type of shock. The shock that people can really survive and thrive through horrible and unimaginable horrors. And that aspect, again, that shock, again, caused them to question quite a lot of the things that they were thinking before. There were other aspects in this study which linked more to how they coped with their work and where they felt there were changed. But I'm not going to talk about this now. If you want, obviously, you can get access to this particular study. But for our discussion, I think that the two aspects that we really found out was, one, that yes, there is an aspect of empathic connection in order for us to grow from our trauma work. And The second thing is that the shock or the thing that we need, that thing that we need in order to grow, was not necessarily the traumatic narrative, but we needed to be exposed to the growth of the client. We need to see the recovery of the client in order for that to create some sort of trigger for a positive change in our assumptions about the world and others. There was also a question of whether or not vicarious trauma and vicarious traumatic growth can occur together, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, or whether they're mutually exclusive, or whether one needs to happen before the other happens, and so forth. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. And it really, in the last study I'm going to talk about, which creates a process of growth and a process of impact of work, I think, is a meta-synthesis. And in this study, what we've done is we've taken as many studies as we can find, qualitative studies, about the impact of trauma work, and any study that had any indication of a positive impact, or that participant had discussed a positive impact, we've included in our meta-synthesis. And what we've done is we've reanalyzed all the interviews and all the results. Again, well, not the interviews themselves, obviously, we didn't have access to that, but all the results as they were reported in the studies. We basically reconfigured them and deconstructed and reconstructed them again in order to understand the process of how you can grow from trauma work. And this is what we found. So we found two separate routes that happen to us when we work with traumatic clients. The first route was an emotional route. So when you're empathically engaged with somebody who has experienced a traumatic event, that will naturally trigger negative emotion, distress, sometimes somatic responses, headaches, tummy aches, and all kinds of those. We will then have to cope with that, and there are all kinds of aspects that helps us cope with that. So organizational aspect, as we've spoken before, like caseload and support supervision, social support, whether it was formal or informal, self-care, optimism, spirituality, and separating our private life from our work life was also one of those things that helped us cope. And if we successfully managed to employ all those coping mechanisms, positive coping mechanisms, we were able to decrease our distress. Alongside this route, there was another route. Also, obviously, time had a factor, because with time, people were able to reduce distress, even if their coping was not necessarily the most positive one. But it took time for people to feel slightly less, or a decrease in distress and negative emotions. And alongside this kind of emotional journey that people were on, there was a cognitive one that happened, and that did include a disbelief of sorts. So the first disbelief was about the trauma itself. So people always report that the first time that they've heard, or a few times that they've heard a traumatic narrative, there's all kinds of things that shock them, that they just couldn't believe that this can happen, and it led them to question what they believe in, and to question the world, and to question how things work, to question themselves and others. And then there was the other shock. And the other shock came later, and that was the shock of resilience, of what us as human beings can actually survive, and how we can thrive through things which are quite horrific. Both of these made people question their basic assumptions. And what we found in this meta-synthesis is there were many, many areas where people who work with traumatized clients reported changes to who they were before. So some of this negative indication of vicarious trauma included people who felt that the world was unsafe, they didn't trust other people, they felt that they were just so worn down that they're not even compassionate about anybody, they're more suspicious about people. Some of them were all kinds of behavior, like more distance relationship and overprotective as parents. And others, alongside those, reporting on a lot of positive changes to the schema, again on the same lines, but the opposite end. So being really appreciative of life and appreciating human resilience, being more compassionate, gaining wisdom, self-awareness, self-worth. Some people were talking about becoming socially activists and actively engaging with the world. And again, the difference between those the changes of vicarious trauma, as you can see them, and the changes of growth were exactly on that continuum of whether or not people were more engaged and open to experiences life, or whether the change was such that they felt that they can't, and they withdrew and were less engaged with life and opportunities. One of the interesting things that we found is that the nature of trauma, the type of trauma work that you do, might have an impact on what it is that has been changed. And I'm saying that because it was very particular about those who were working with survivors of child sexual abuse, who almost all of them have reported some sort of change in the level of trust of other people. Some of them change in the level of trust of men in generally, and some change in terms of personal relationship. I have to say that some of these negative changes were alongside some other positive changes, but generally what is highlighted is there might be that some of our cognitions are changing according to the content of the trauma that we're working with. Now, as I just mentioned, these vicarious trauma versus post-traumatic growth, it's not that clear-cut between the two. It did happen that in some cases, some people had some of the schematic assumptions change in one direction, while others change in slightly a different direction. So it's a very kind of complex system that we are experiencing and seeing. And the last thing that I'm going to just say about this is whether or not distress was related to that. And we could not answer this question, because if you look at what people are saying around PTSD and post-traumatic growth, there are all kinds of findings. Some people find that people who've experienced post-traumatic growth have to have a lower level of PTSD. Some people say they are not linked together. You can either have high level of distress or low level of distress. It is not related to growth. And some theory says actually you have to have a certain level of distress in order to experience growth. And similarly with vicarious trauma, we're not quite sure whether you have to have some sort of an emotional negative impact that would trigger a change in order to experience growth, or whether the two are unrelated. Our model suggests that they might be unrelated, because what really triggers the growth is the client's resilience, which is very different than the shock that we get from the traumatic narrative. But again, this is something which we need to inquire into a little bit more in the future. Just to sum up this particular study before I go on to sum up kind of my general talk. So this this model of post-traumatic growth highlighted that there's what we call the resilience shock that we need to experience. And it does seem straightforward, but it does has implications to the type of trauma work that you do. So if you're doing trauma work as a therapist and you get a chance to work with somebody and you know, work with them or be with them through their journey, then you will have a chance to be exposed to that resilience aspect. But if you're doing helpline work, which some of you might do, or if you're doing different type of work where you actually meet people at the most distressed time, then you might not have a chance to see them when they come at the other end. You might not have the chance to see how they thrive, even because you've been exposed mainly to the negative impact or the traumatic narrative when they were most in need. So I think that might have an impact on the level of post-traumatic growth that people might experience. As I said, before, so some schemas were changed in one direction, others in another direction, and the implication is that things don't have to be perfect in order for us to experience growth. So even if some of us still feel quite distressed from our work, it doesn't mean that we cannot find or acknowledge the positive changes in ourselves that happen because of that work. And as I said before, the type of trauma work might have an impact, but there's more research. So wrapping up what I've been talking about for the last 50 odd minutes, I'm going to summarize it and talk a little bit about how to avoid vicarious trauma and how to facilitate vicarious post-traumatic growth. I think that it'll be a little bit easier to speak about how to avoid vicarious trauma than the other part, and I'll explain it in a minute. But generally, I just want to start by saying that if vicarious trauma is not just any negative emotion that you have because of your trauma work. As I said before, anybody who does trauma work will have negative emotion and will be impacted by the work that they're doing. Otherwise, they're probably not doing their work. So not every distress feeling that we feel is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is a sustainable or pervasive or long-term change to our cognitive schema. While most of us will feel some local and appropriate emotional response, this is not necessarily a vicarious trauma. We still need support in that, but vicarious trauma is a much more sustained and extended change in ourselves and our approach to life, which causes us to close ourselves to life and opportunities. In order to prevent it, so there's obviously some stuff that we discussed that the organization can do, and some of it is got to do with diversifying work as much as we can and when we can. Find support, so take your colleagues and go and have a coffee somewhere, have a pint or a good meal, or really it sounds very trivial, but it really does help. And self-care, whatever it is that you do that helps you, it can be going, yoga or sports, or other people do other things. But I think that the main principle is, again, re-engaging with life and not getting to a situation where you are not engaged with life and living overall. One of the most important things about vicarious trauma, as it is with secondary traumatic stress, burnout and compassion fatigue, is detection. Because the earliest you notice that something is wrong, the earliest you can go and get support. And that's got to do with psychoeducation. So hopefully after today you'll be a little bit more aware of what these processes are about, and you'll be able maybe to recognize some of the initial signs of changes in yourself, and then be able to go and get some help. In particular times of our life, so if you already know that there's something's going on in your life, which means that you are already in some sort of distress or under stress, then that's, again, a very good time to go and get some support and help. And finally, facilitating growth. And I'm going to start by saying, well, you can't really make yourself grow, and that's the happiness paradox. So the more you search for happiness, the less likely you are to find it. And when it comes to growth, it's a little bit like that, because growth is a naturally occurring response. It's not something that we can create. It's just something that happens under certain conditions. And it's really important for me to stress that while growth can happen, I hope that it was clear that this is a cognitive change, and some people might already have basic assumptions or basic approaches to life, which are already means that they feel compassionate and spiritual and find life meaningful. So in that sense, working with trauma may not create a massive change in their perceptions, because they already were in a place where they could accommodate for the shock of human resilience. They already knew that, in a sense, so the system was already such that it could accommodate for that. They didn't need to change anything. So it does not mean that they're not coping well or they're not great people. It just means that there wasn't enough disparity between what they saw and the system in order to change the system. So it's just really important to differentiate between growth, which is a change in ourselves and our approach to life, and happiness, opposed to coping, which are very different things. Those of us who have changed our perceptions and ourselves and our approach to life because of our work, again, as I said, this was naturally occurring, and the only way that you can actually the only thing that you could do with growth is actually notice it, and that is fairly important. It's important to do with yourself, so be mindful of who you are and how you've changed, and reflect on that from time to time. And I think it's also important to do with our clients, and to see where they are with that process themselves, if they can do that. And with this positive notion in mind, I think that I have completed my lecture. So, Jack, if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.
Thank you very much for that, Kieran. That was a really, really interesting presentation and very, very thorough. And I think it may well have answered quite a few of the questions that I have received. But one of the things I was just sort of wondering was, were there any sorts of organisations that you might be able to recommend and signpost people to who can sort of offer that support that people can go to provide that support for them?
Well, they will normally be within the organisations or within the professional bodies. So it depends where people belong to. So I don't know any, apart from professional organisation that people belong to, like UKCP, BACP for counsellors, psychotherapists, BPS for psychologists. I'm sorry, I don't know all the other kind of necessarily professional bodies. There aren't any particular bodies that I know that provide support for people for professionals who work with trauma. So it's either within your own organisation or within the professional organisation you belong to.
Okay, perfect. I think that's really helpful. I've not actually received any further questions. I think a huge amount of it was covered in the presentation, and there was a huge amount of really interesting sort of information provided and very helpful as well. So just thank you very much from us for the presentation. It was very, very interesting to hear, and thank you for giving up your time today for speaking at the event.
That's okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you find it helpful.
And thank you also to everyone who's attended the event today, and I hope that you've all found the event really useful, and you'll be able to take away some of the information today, and that will provide something beneficial towards you. But thank you very much again to everyone for attending, and I'll now shut down the webinar. So thanks very much again, Kieran.
Thank you.
Thank you.